so you can just go ahead and take a seat, and we're just going to start with the radio thing.
Yeah.
I basically cut down the
Okay.
WVR piece to like 5 minutes,
All right.
so you can just put these on. And you can just go ahead and sit down and hit play whenever you're ready.
All right.
And when you're done, just take them off and just go ahead and give me your thoughts, you know?
I mean, do you want to give me some sort of prompt or like?
Just give me like your initial thoughts, you know, natural reaction to it,
Okay.
based on the work you've done, and yeah.
All right.
Cool.
Let's see how this goes.
All right.
I'm Asma Khalid with 90.9 WBUR and WBUR.org.
And I'm Sean Bowden, a freelance producer in Boston. All year long, we've been looking back at the 40th anniversary of Boston's public school desegregation.
Thousands of kids were ordered to take school buses across town to different neighborhoods. The goal was to create a racial balance in the city's schools.
We all know that the experiment did not go smoothly.
Busing in Boston was an uncontrolled experiment in social engineering.
As city officials scrambled to comply with the judge's order, they focused on logistics, but not the emotional and psychological well-being of the students. We've all heard that the backlash against busing was about race.
But for many of those who lived through it, that opposition was more about class, heavy-handed government, and a desire to protect the neighborhood.
40 years on, the debate continues as to whether or not busing was necessary in the city of Boston.
The schools were integrated, but not permanently.
The trauma was felt by students and their families, and the damage to Boston's reputation as a progressive and inclusive city still lingers to this day.
Yeah, you can just put it down.
So I think that type of framing that this radio piece puts on the desegregation kind of repeats the same patterns and repeats kind of the same narrative that has been happening for 40 years.
What comes about is who interprets the story. It's the media, it's historians, it's who writes, who gets published, it's who gets Pulitzer Prize. They command the story.
One of the most famous images of Boston school desegregation, an image that many people are familiar with, is The Spoiling of Old Glory, the Pulitzer Prize-winning photograph of a white, quote-unquote, anti-busser attacking an African-American man with the American flag. Really conveys this dynamic of African-Americans really just as victims in the movement, when in reality, African-Americans led a very dynamic protest movement to achieve racial justice in the Boston public schools for at least 40 years.
The interpretation completely left out the fact that African Americans have been fighting for justice historically over decades in the schools, working towards changing the schools. Completely left out. Very, very rarely do you see stories about what African American parents, leaders did.
There's like we call it the master narrative, which is kind of, it's kind of hard to pin down sometimes, but it's the one that keeps us asking the same questions and keep kind of spinning our wheels on a lot of these issues.
The key person, her name was Ruth Batson. And anyone who knows anything about Boston and Boston school desegregation knows the name Ruth Batson.
4, Team D.
So, Mrs. Batson, when your kids were in school, were you satisfied with the quality of the education that they were getting?
No, I wasn't, but I wasn't sure of why I wasn't satisfied. I was living in the Orchard Park Housing Project, and 2 of my children were attending the Dearborn School. And I was very concerned with their education because I had the feeling from talking with other parents in other parts of the city that the education was different. And I read in the paper that an organization called the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People had opened an office on the corner of Massachusetts Avenue and Tremont Street. So one day I went up there and I saw the president. And I told him this story, and I told him that based on the other meetings that I had attended, that I felt that something was wrong with the school, and particularly in the schools where black kids were. 3 days later, the president called me and said, Mrs. Batson, we've decided to set up a subcommittee, which we will call the Public School Committee. And we'd like to ask you if you would be the chairperson of that committee.
That is the start of this committee that begins to challenge the Boston Public Schools. She chairs it and gathers 4 or 5 other people, one of whom is the person that I mentioned, Paul Parks.
As a part of that quality education, I don't believe that quality education could ever be achieved without integration. So part of my definition of quality education includes integration of the school youngsters.
Ruth was connected to almost everyone. So some of her, maybe closest contemporaries, people like Mel King.
For the children that we're serving. That's what you're doing. You're stopping the very progress that you lip service say that you're interested in having.
There's a fairly large group of really powerful black women in this movement. So people like Ellen Jackson, a little bit later, because Ellen was a little bit younger than her, Betty Johnson, anyone that was sort of anyone in the movement, Ken Guscott, Elma Lewis, Muriel and Otto Snowden.
Well, I was so excited, I thought this was wonderful, but that determined my life. My whole life has been pointed in that direction, and the improvement of education for black kids.
Great. Cut. Fabulous.
The earliest work really of the NAACP Education Committee that, as I said, Ruth was leading was around just investigating what was happening, because what the Boston School Committee was doing was hiding conditions in the Boston public schools.
When we would go to white schools, we'd see these lovely classrooms, small sizes, a small number of children in each class. The teachers were permanent. We would see wonderful materials. When we'd go to our schools, we would see overcrowded classrooms, children sitting out in the corridors and so forth. And so then we decided that where there were a large number of white students, that's where the care went, that's where the books went, that's where the money went.
Take 11.
Just lean back a little bit, baby. Okay.
Okay. So, can you give me that topic sentence?
Here I was, a brand new teacher, coming into my first teaching experience, and I walked into this old building built in 1842, named after a wonderful New England writer, Louisa May Alcott, and I had 42 students, 36 seats, and had to sit the kids at the kidney reading table, and not enough of anything to make it an easy teaching experience.
And the school's old, and I had my first grade classroom, and there were 45 kids in it. Now, remember this, 45 children, and I am a brand new teacher.
We didn't have new crayons. We had a box of old nubbly crayons. Pencils had to be collected at the end of the day so you would have enough for the children for the next day. There wasn't enough white paper. The yellow paper was brown on the edges. It had been stored and saved and hoarded so there would be enough. And primary line paper was very hard to come by.
There were concentrated areas that were predominantly black. If not, the school that I talked about and I went into in 65, it was 99% black.
It was a de jure segregated system. There was a system for white kids and a system for black kids, with Asians and Latinos in the mix too. The other aspect of it is that the vast majority of teachers, administration, principals, faculty were white. So you had black, Latino, Asian kids being taught by white teachers with white principals and white faculty.
Corporal punishment was also extremely common and brutal in predominantly black schools, so this was another major issue that black parents turned activists were discovering, particularly in the early 1950s.
We went to another teacher's room who was another teacher, and heard a noise and found a little girl that she had put tape across her mouth and put her in the closet because she talked too much, and left it and forgot. It was a Friday evening and forgot her. We got her out, found a parent, And the parent said, what should I do? And I said, go to the NAACP. That's when I discovered that there was this movement that had existed for so long.
Okay, can you give me a sense of what political activities had gone on, what your feeling was about the rate of success with dealing at the city, state, and federal level in terms of this issue?
We started dealing at the city level because that was the most logical thing to do. Nobody thought we were going to wind up dealing with an issue as big as what it eventually became, and nothing succeeded at the city level. We got no support. We couldn't even get the Boston School Committee to acknowledge that there were schools that were segregated, never mind how it happened.
The Boston School Committee was a unique political body. For one thing, it had always been used as a stepping stone to a higher office. Very seldom did you hear real educational issues discussed. Now, Louise Day Hicks was chairperson of the school committee at that time, and it's interesting to note that some of the people on the NAACP General Committee felt that she would meet our concerns favorably. Well, Louise turned out to be not fine at all. She was an enemy from the minute that we stepped into that door.
She became the loudest voice, and in fact, won elections by saying, you know where I stand.
You know where I stand. Well, we knew where she stood. She was trying to stand on our neck.
There's a very famous encounter when NAACP activists go to a meeting of the Boston School Committee on June 11th of 1963, and they show up at the meeting to present, and Ruth is in charge of this.
So we go prepared to the school system, and we were really innocent. We were naive. I think that even Paul and Mel would acknowledge that.
And essentially what happens is that huge numbers of black activists come to the meeting, and those who aren't able to come in wait outside and start to lead a protest rally outside. Louise Day Hicks and other Boston School Committee members are extremely hostile towards activists and essentially cut off the meeting.
One day is heard, another day.
Everything broke loose. We were insulted. We were told our kids were stupid, and this is why they didn't learn. We were completely rejected that night. The press came out, NAACP is wrong, this is wrong. We got very little public support, and we got absolutely no political support. The black community turned its efforts to trying to set up various programs to give parents options because we were not getting any place with the Boston School Committee.
They knew something had to be done for these kids. And they needed alternatives for these kids. And so everyone pitched in from everywhere, just about.
And we tried everything. We tried meeting with people.
They've run for political office. They've challenged the Boston School Committee. They've formed their own schools.
Sit-ins and the stay-outs and the meetings and all kinds of things happen.
We tried creating new schools. We tried finding opportunities through Metco for kids to go outside the Boston public schools but still stay in public schools.
They formed freedom schools. They formed after-school tutoring programs.
I haven't even talked about what students were doing at that time. I mean, there were students that were picketing schools. There were students who were in schools. There was an entire Boston student movement.
I think it's going to be a thing just like it was in 68, 69, 70, and so on, where they just don't do anything at all.
What's going to make it different then?
The students will make it different.
We couldn't create enough opportunities for enough of these kids. And we were finally left with the reality that our kids were going to be, for the most part, in the public school system. And it was the public school system we had to deal with. And there was only one place we could go, and that was to court. It was literally the court of last resort.
So in June of 1974, Judge Arthur Garrity, again, probably one of the most well-known figures of this movement, issues his ruling in favor of the plaintiffs and finds that the Boston Public Schools are clearly racially segregated as a result of purposeful action by the Boston School Committee, so by city school officials.
It is illegal to segregate kids. That's it in a nutshell. There's a lot during the 40th anniversary that provides the general public with this sense that how could the judge do whatever it is that he did. I remember asking Mel King at one point, what do you think of the judge's order? And he looked at me like I was insane, and he said, he followed the law. What do you mean what I think about a judge's order? That's got to be so clear to people.
The Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, because its investigations also found violations of the 14th Amendment in the Boston school system.
There was so much evidence that showed that the school committee violated the law, that in effect the judge had no other option other than to say they were in violation. Now the remedy is really what people are talking about. They're concerned about buses.
The actual work in developing a remedy did not start until Garrity's decision came down in June of '74. That's the reality. People find that hard to believe.
He had hoped that the Boston School Committee would give him a plan to desegregate the schools, and he gives them one last opportunity to do so in the summer, and they failed to do so, or the plan that they submit is, again, woefully inadequate. So he uses a plan created by the State Department of Education, which is usually referred to as Phase 1 integration, which took place in the school year of 1974 to 1975.
The immediacy of it is, it's got to change. Already generations have been lost. It's got to change immediately. Now, some others would say, gradualism. Let's do this gradually. Well, those others who say it, their kids are not in those schools. Those kids, their kids are in better schools.
The pairing between Roxbury and South Boston was only problematic because white Bostonians in South Boston resisted it with such racial hostility. It's the response of white Bostonians, which I think is problematic, rather than the plan itself.
Mark. Okay, Jackie.
Okay, so let's begin, Tracy, with your telling me, describe for me what the mood in South Boston was in the summer leading up to the opening of school in 1974.
I would say that the mood was of anticipation.
There will be, there's no question in my mind about it, civil disobedience. You will not take their children away from them. Thank you very much.
We had encountered the wrath of people in South Boston, and I just felt that they were bigoted. I just felt that they made it very clear that they didn't like black people, and I was prepared for them not to want black students coming to school, plus which they said it. They made it very clear.
Had that reaction, and it was in the South, it was called racism. Here in the North, it's called anti-busing, resistance. I know this is not a likable comparison, but it is. It's the same exact thing. It is saying, I don't want my kid going to school with that kid who's different, who's of another race. I don't want my kid going there.
I thought that maybe some people were talking out of two sides of their mouth, if you will. That in fact it had been all right for years to send their children to parochial schools, but all of a sudden now They were fighting for neighborhood schools.
In 1972, 85% of high school students and 50% of elementary schools are already riding buses to attend schools outside their neighborhood. The difference is that before the court orders, they're riding buses to attend segregated schools, and that the court orders are demanding that they ride buses to now attend integrated schools. So this language of busing is is really used as a distraction. And activists, black activists, knew this.
By 1976, busing was a nationwide code word for keep the niggers in their place. I mean, we knew what it meant. They didn't have to tell us what it meant. We knew what it meant, okay?
Now, I want you to remember not to come into the present. Speak from back then, and tell me if you felt that what the black community was going through was worth it.
I felt that what took place absolutely had to happen. It may not have had to happen that way if there had been a different kind of leadership provided by white Bostonians of all classes and all neighborhoods.
I never heard any public official on the state level or on the city level come out and say, this is a good thing, we should all learn together, we should all live together. There was no encouragement from anybody. I call it complete official neglect.
Simply stated, I am for integration, I am against forced busing, and they are not mutually or morally exclusive.
Desegregation took place without discourse between teachers in districts, between parents and teachers. It just happened without any leadership to prepare the way.
We didn't have a strategy for taking over the schools. We didn't have enough political clout to oust the school committee. And they were as recalcitrant and as racist and as demagogic and as irresponsible as a school committee could be. So we were almost bystanders.
For those of us around the city that decided to support the desegregation order, it was very much a lonely place for a long time.
Great, thank you.
Cut. Okay, can you talk about just the media's role? Because that's in Boston, but that became that reaction became the national memory of what happened, even though it shouldn't have been.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to say about good to say about the media's role.
What really all media sources are doing, and that would include both other more liberal national media sources, they're all using this language of busing and of neighborhood schools, sort of regardless of whether they're supporting the court's orders or not.
Much of what you see in the media comes from the perspective of the reporter. There's really, and from the writer, and from the author. There's really this idea that there's this impartiality. It's not quite true.
And this situation is expected to continue until Friday, when the court rules. Mike Levitt, Channel 5 News at the Fifield School.
Probably the most well-known book about the Boston school desegregation, of course, is Anthony Lucas's Common Ground, which won the Pulitzer Prize. Common Ground, I find very problematic in that it, again, really does not talk about black activism at all.
The fact that they had agency, they were activists, that was absent from the story.
Ruth very famously said when she read the book, she felt like she'd been cut off at the knees. Anthony Lucas stole our movement.
She's probably the person, along with Mel, that I would want to ask what they think about the schools today. And I tend to think that if it were Ruth, she would be saddened that we are still so completely divided by race. The idea of where kids are today lacks history, therefore it lacks context. You hear people say, well, people did all that, and look at this, we have a black school. Well, we don't have the same that we had before. We don't have exactly the same. And there's another fight to be held, and it may not be a fight of integration. It is a different kind of fight for resources.
What happened in 1974 is not disconnected from what's happening now. The schools are essentially segregated in a different way. And we believe that's in part because we haven't fully interrogated our past and come to terms with it,
real quick on that, Christelle. Don't you think something, if somebody interferes with a case, don't you think something could go?
I think adding this story is a wonderful thing. I know in the past, it hasn't been a part of the curriculum of the Boston Public Schools, which seems really shocking, right?
When they learned about desegregation of schools, they learned about Little Rock, Arkansas. They didn't, even though this happened to their parents and their grandparents and their neighbors.
Very few people, if I go around and talk to people about this and interview people or have this discussion, I get constantly, I didn't know this, unless I tell you some books and people to read. I never knew about this.
I don't think it's possible to overlook the importance of this history of Black political activism in the context of what's happening today in places like Ferguson, where we have law enforcement using deadly force against African American communities. And so I think we really need histories like this, which look at this longer history of racial inequality.
And if you're going to be an informed, educated citizen and able to ask critical questions and able to take critical action around your education in your city, then you need to know what happened here and is happening here.